"Excuse me," the flight attendant's voice cut sharp through the comm. "I need you both to move to the back. Those seats aren't for you." Micah looked up, steady and composed, then said 5 words that froze the entire cabin. "We're not moving. Call the captain." Seconds later, a voice echoed over the intercom, not the captain's, but the airline's vice president, and that's when everything changed. The terminal buzzed with energy as the early morning rush swept through Charlotte Douglas International Airport. Business travelers hurried past with suitcases clicking behind them, eyes fixed on departure screens, coffee cups in hand, earbuds in place. Amid the blur of pressed suits and non-stop announcements, 2 siblings stood quietly at gate B27. Micah Johnson, 17 years old, stood with calm focus, his posture straight, his eyes tracking every movement around them. He wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, his black slacks neatly pressed, polished shoes catching the airport lights. Beside him, his 15-year-old sister Sierra leaned gently against her carry-on bag. She clutched a small gold-wrapped gift box in her hands, a birthday present for their grandmother in Atlanta. Her curly hair was pinned back neatly, her outfit modest and composed. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had traveled before, and they knew how to move through the world quietly. When their boarding group was called, Micah nodded at Sierra and the 2 stepped forward. The gate agent, a man with graying temples and a welcoming smile, scanned their first-class boarding passes and gave a quick nod. "Enjoy your flight," he said warmly. They both thanked him politely and moved onto the jet bridge. The first-class cabin of the Airbus A320 was softly lit, with rows of plush leather seats and the low hum of pre-flight conversation. Some passengers were sipping orange juice, others tapping away on tablets. Micah and Sierra found their seats in row 1B, stored their small bags in the overhead bin, and sat down. Micah gazed out the window, his expression unreadable, while Sierra carefully slid the gold box under the seat in front of her. Everything felt normal. Comfortable. Until it didn't. A shadow fell across them. "Excuse me," a sharp voice cut in. Micah turned. A tall woman stood before them, arms crossed, her uniform immaculate. Her name tag read Dana McMillan, and she carried herself like someone who'd spent decades running her cabin with absolute control. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" she asked, her tone more accusation than question. Micah blinked once, measured. "Yes, ma'am. This is row 1B. First class." Dana narrowed her eyes. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" Without hesitation, Micah retrieved both his and Sierra's tickets and handed them over. Dana inspected them carefully, lips pursed. The seat numbers matched. The class matched. The names were clear. But her face didn't soften. "All right," she said flatly, handing them back without a smile. "Just checking." She walked off without another word. Micah turned slightly toward Sierra, whose hands were now folded tightly around the gold box. Her eyes had changed, still quiet, but troubled. Micah gave her a small nod. "It's fine," he said softly. But the hum of peace from earlier had started to shift. More passengers boarded. Bags thumped into overhead compartments. Safety announcements began to play softly from the monitors. The engines vibrated beneath their feet, warming up for takeoff. Dana returned. She didn't ask for their tickets this time. She didn't smile or explain. She simply stood before them again, arms crossed, voice firm. "I'm going to need you both to move to the back. There's been a change." Micah looked up, confused. "I'm sorry?" "Your seats are needed for another passenger," Dana said, her voice louder this time. "We already showed you our passes," Micah replied, calm but steady. "There's been a reassignment," Dana snapped. "Please gather your things." Sierra's voice was barely a whisper. "We didn't do anything wrong." Micah didn't move. "We're not moving," he said. Then added, cool and unbothered, "Call the captain." Dana's jaw tensed. "If you won't comply, I'll call security." Her voice had risen enough now that heads turned. The quiet cabin began to shift. Whispers stirred. Nearby passengers looked over with raised brows. A businessman in row 2 subtly turned down the volume on his headphones. Dana's eyes darted between them, then she turned and marched up the aisle with purpose. Sierra leaned toward Micah, her voice shaking. "I sent the message." He nodded once. "Good." At the front of the plane, Dana picked up the intercom and pressed the button to the cockpit. "Captain Reynolds, I have 2 non-compliant passengers in first class. They're refusing to move after a seat reassignment. Requesting ground assistance." There was a short silence. Then a voice came through, not Captain Reynolds. "This is Kenneth Brooks. Care to repeat what you just said?" The entire cabin stilled. Dana froze mid-sentence. Her fingers slipped off the intercom button. A man in the third row leaned toward his wife. "Did he say Kenneth Brooks?" Dana turned her head slowly, her face draining of color. "Brooks," she whispered under her breath. The voice came again, clear and slow. "Yes. Kenneth Brooks. Executive Vice President of this airline. You just attempted to relocate my niece and nephew from their assigned first-class seats. Do you have an explanation?" Passengers looked around now, fully alert. Even those who hadn't been paying attention before now leaned in. Micah sat quietly. Sierra's hand still rested on the gold gift box. Dana stood like a statue. The cockpit door opened. Captain Reynolds stepped out, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, his face unreadable. He walked calmly toward Dana, stopping beside her. "You said there was a seat issue," he said, voice low. "You didn't mention the Johnson family." Dana tried to speak, but her voice cracked. Nothing came out. Captain Reynolds turned to the siblings. "Micah. Sierra. Are you all right?" Micah nodded. "Yes, sir." "Thank you." The captain turned back to Dana. His voice still low, but cutting. "Ms. McMillan, return to the galley. I'll speak with you shortly." Dana backed away without a word, her face pale. As she passed the rows of passengers, they watched her in silence. Some with wide eyes. Others with tight-lipped recognition. No one said a word, but the message was loud. She had crossed a line, and the cabin knew it. Back in row 1B, Sierra whispered, "Do you think she knows who Uncle Kenneth is now?" Micah replied without looking up. "She does now." In the rear galley, Dana gripped the edge of the counter, her breathing shallow. She had worked this airline for over a decade. She had trained new hires, handled emergencies, controlled dozens of full cabins without incident. But none of that mattered now. Because today, she had seen 2 black teenagers in first class and assumed they didn't belong. She didn't know who they were. But she didn't care either. And now she had to. At the front of the cabin, the intercom crackled once more. This time, Captain Reynolds spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, this flight will be delayed briefly due to an internal personnel matter. Thank you for your patience." He didn't mention names. He didn't explain. But every passenger in first class understood exactly what was happening. And Dana McMillan, still gripping the edge of the galley counter, understood too. She wasn't the authority anymore. She was the problem. And the flight hadn't even left the ground. Dana's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the galley counter, staring blankly ahead, her mind racing. The voice that had just come through the intercom, wasn't the captain's. It was deeper, more commanding, and carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Kenneth Brooks. One of the airline's founding partners. A name she had seen on internal memos, company newsletters, executive briefings, a name she never imagined would come down on her over something as simple as a seating dispute. But it wasn't simple anymore. Not after that voice echoed through the cabin. Not after passengers turned in their seats and stared. Not after she realized the 2 teenagers she had tried to move, Micah and Sierra Johnson, were his family. And now she was spiraling, not just in thought, but in reality. Because in the forward cabin, silence had replaced small talk, tension had replaced routine, and every eye had shifted from suspicion toward the two teens to something colder, judgment, yes, but not for them. For her. Up front, Captain Reynolds stood near row 1B, hands loosely clasped behind his back. He addressed Micah and Sierra with professional calm. "You're all right?" he asked. Micah gave a short, firm nod. "Yes, sir." "Thank you." The captain's expression didn't shift much, but there was something in his eyes now, something serious, something final. He turned to address the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. This flight is temporarily delayed due to a staffing matter. We appreciate your understanding." No names were spoken, but everyone knew who he meant. Dana heard it from the back, and it landed like a blow. A staffing matter. That was her. Her knees felt unsteady. She backed further into the galley, forcing herself to breathe. For 12 years she had worked flights without incident. She'd seen passengers yell, she'd broken up arguments, de-escalated drunk travelers, even once helped during a medical emergency mid-air. She'd prided herself on running a tight ship. No nonsense. No exceptions. But this wasn't turbulence. This was a freefall. And she didn't know how to pull up. A flight attendant approached from the mid-cabin, a younger woman named Rachel who had only been with the airline for 2 years. She stopped just short of the galley, her expression uneasy. "Captain Reynolds wants to see you," she said quietly. Dana swallowed hard. "Now?" he said immediately. The walk back up the aisle felt longer than it ever had. Passengers didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Dana could feel their eyes on her. Not curious anymore. Cold. Calculating. Judgmental. She had become the subject of the flight. The reason they were still grounded. At the front of the aircraft, the cockpit door was open. Captain Reynolds waited just outside it, arms crossed. In the jump seat beside the bulkhead, a printed message rested in his hand. Dana stepped forward. "Captain," she began, trying to sound composed. He didn't look up from the paper. "Dana, operations has been briefed. Mr. Brooks is on the ground. You are suspended from duty as of this moment." She blinked. "Suspended?" "Effective immediately," he said. "Operations is sending documentation. You'll surrender your badge before landing." Her throat tightened. "We're mid-boarding. You're suspending me before the flight even takes off?" "Yes," the captain said simply. "Because this isn't a passenger complaint. It's a corporate violation. And we don't fly with uncertainty in the air." Dana felt her heart pound louder than the engines outside. She turned to speak, maybe to explain, maybe to defend herself, but Captain Reynolds raised a hand. "Don't make this worse." She turned without a word, the sting behind her eyes beginning to build. As she returned to the rear galley, she passed Micah and Sierra. They were still seated in row 1B. Still calm. Still silent. And still holding the cabin's full attention. Sierra cradled the gift in her lap like it was something sacred. Her eyes briefly met Dana's as she passed. She didn't speak. She didn't look away. And that hurt more than words ever could. Dana reached the back galley and sat down in the jump seat. A folded paper from operations had arrived via the cockpit printer. She opened it with shaking hands. Employee suspension, immediate removal from active duty pending termination review. All identification and access credentials to be surrendered on board. At the bottom, the signature block read "Authorized by Kenneth Brooks." Her badge, clipped to her chest just an hour ago with pride, now felt heavy. Embarrassing. She unclipped it slowly, staring at the gold letters of her name. Dana McMillan. Senior Cabin Supervisor. Her hands trembled as she placed it in the envelope. Across the cabin, a male passenger leaned toward Micah and spoke in a soft voice. "Just wanted to say you handled that better than most adults would." Proud of you. Micah offered a polite nod. Thank you. The man didn't ask questions. He just sat back and watched the quiet unfold. A few rows back, a woman pulled out her phone and started typing. Others were whispering. The crew stayed out of sight. No one wanted to draw attention. And Dana sat there, stripped of her authority, stripped of her role, feeling like the walls of the aircraft had closed in around her. The jump seat no longer felt like a command post. It felt like punishment. Like isolation. A message pinged in the flight crew's internal system. Rachel, the junior attendant, read it from the front display and hesitated before walking back to Dana. Operations just confirmed, she said quietly. You're to exit via the employee terminal. Security will meet the plane on arrival. Dana's mouth opened slightly. Security? They don't want you leaving in uniform. Like I'm a criminal? Rachel didn't answer. She just stepped away. Dana's shoulders sagged. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking again. She had made a judgment call. A wrong one. And now that judgment was being made about her. For the rest of the flight, no announcements were made about her status. But the silence spoke volumes. Passengers sat quietly, watching her without watching her, talking without speaking. The plane no longer buzzed with normal travel energy. It hummed with tension, with awareness, with a subtle sense of justice playing out at 35,000 feet before they even left the runway. At the front, Micah and Sierra sat still. Not gloating. Not victorious. Just dignified. Sierra leaned her head against Micah's shoulder. He rested his hand lightly on hers. They didn't need to say anything. Everyone had seen. Everyone knew. And from the back of the aircraft, Dana stared straight ahead at the galley wall. She was no longer in charge. She was no longer even part of the flight. She had boarded as the authority, the supervisor, the decision-maker. But now, before the wheels even left the tarmac, she had already fallen. The cabin lights remained dim as the aircraft rolled toward the gate, the engines whispering into silence beneath the weight of everything that had happened midair. Dana McMillan sat stiffly in the rear jump seat, her uniform still on but her badge already gone, folded into a sealed envelope and handed off without ceremony. She hadn't moved in over 30 minutes, hadn't spoken, hadn't even blinked much. Her mind was frozen on one moment, Micah's calm voice, steady and unbothered, telling her they weren't moving unless the captain said so. And then the voice that followed, not from the cockpit but the one that carried through the entire system like a commandment from above. Kenneth Brooks. She'd thought authority lived in rank. She'd forgotten it lived in reputation. The plane came to a stop with a soft lurch, and the familiar ding of the seatbelt sign turning off filled the cabin. Passengers remained seated, unusually still. There was no rush to the aisle. No scrambling for overhead bags. No impatient sighs. Just silence. A different kind of silence. Not the kind that came from being tired after a long flight, but the kind that hung heavy with understanding. With judgment. With awareness. Micah and Sierra Johnson stayed in their seats in row 1B, as instructed. Sierra held the small gold box gently in her lap, the ribbon still perfectly tied, untouched since they boarded. Micah sat upright, composed, his eyes steady but not cold. The message had been sent hours ago, through a voice, through a presence, through patience. They hadn't yelled. They hadn't resisted. They simply held the line. And the line had held. At the front of the aircraft, the jet bridge door opened, letting in a rush of cool, filtered terminal air. A few airline staff stepped on board, quiet, efficient, all dressed in dark navy suits. Beside them stood Kenneth Brooks. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He was the statement. He was the authority now filling the space that Dana had once thought was hers. Dana didn't rise. She couldn't. Her legs felt locked in place. Her throat was dry. Her palms were still damp from the moment she handed over her badge. It didn't feel real, not yet. She'd given commands in this uniform. Led full crews. Filed reports. Taught on boarding. Now she was just another name in a story passengers would retell long after the flight landed. Kenneth spoke with the captain first, then quietly exchanged words with a uniformed security officer. He turned and looked down the aisle, not past anyone, not around anyone, but directly at Dana. She caught the look. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even hard. It was exact. A corporate acknowledgement of consequence. One of the officers stepped forward. "Miss McMillan," he said softly, professionally. "You'll come with us now." She nodded once and stood slowly. Her knees trembled, and she reached instinctively for the wall to steady herself. Her small duffel bag had already been pulled from the storage locker and set at the rear galley. She picked it up with both hands and began to walk down the aisle. Every step echoed. Passengers didn't clap. They didn't jeer. They didn't have to. Their silence was enough. It wrapped around her like judgment. It stripped her of dignity more cleanly than any formal announcement. Row by row, she passed the faces of people who had watched her challenge two teenagers for sitting in seats they had paid for. Faces that had turned to her when she raised her voice and now turned away as she lowered her gaze. As she reached row 1B, she didn't look at Sierra. She didn't dare. But she felt the girl's gaze, steady and unbroken. A kind of clarity only a child raised with respect could offer. She passed, and for a moment, everything around her disappeared, the cabin, the lights, the hush of passengers. It was just her, carrying the weight of a mistake made public. At the open door, Kenneth Brooks stepped aside and let the security officer lead. She followed, head down, not as a professional, not even as a disgraced employee, but as a person unmade by her own choices. The jet bridge felt longer than she remembered. At the end of it, a side door marked airline personnel only stood open. Inside was a waiting room with 2 chairs, a folding table, and a staff member holding a clipboard. "Sign here," the man said simply. Dana did. Her hands shook as she scribbled her name on the line that confirmed the surrender of her badge, her credentials, her security key, and her position. When she looked up, the man didn't smile. "You'll be escorted out the employee exit. We recommend not passing through the main terminal. There's media interest." Dana blinked. "Media?" A few passengers recorded the exchange. "It's already online." She didn't respond. She couldn't. The world she tried to command was now watching her fall. Back on board, Micah and Sierra remained seated. A staff member approached them gently. "Mr. Brooks would like to speak with you before you go. Would you come with me?" They rose. Sierra still held the box carefully, like a symbol of everything they'd done right: show up prepared, act respectfully, sit where they belonged, and not move when asked to surrender their space. The same walk Dana had just taken now carried a very different energy. As Micah and Sierra reached the aircraft door, Kenneth offered a nod, nothing exaggerated, just quiet affirmation. "You both okay?" he asked. Sierra nodded once. "Yes, sir." Kenneth motioned toward a nearby lounge just beyond the gate, glass-walled and private. "Let's talk in there." Inside, the siblings sat across from him at a sleek table. Kenneth didn't sit right away. He placed both hands on the back of the chair and studied them for a moment. "You handled that better than most grown executives would have," he said. "You didn't raise your voices. You didn't make a scene. That takes strength." Micah looked at his uncle with quiet resolve. "I didn't want it to go that far." "Neither did I," Kenneth replied. "But sometimes people have to see the line before they realize they crossed it." Sierra shifted slightly in her seat. "Will she lose everything?" Kenneth paused. "She already has. Not because of who you are, but because of who she decided you weren't." The room fell quiet for a moment. Outside, the airport moved like normal, rolling suitcases, gate announcements, casual laughter. But inside, something deeper had settled. A truth about power, assumption, and silence. Kenneth reached into a folder and pulled out a printed draft. "This will go public in the next hour," he said, sliding it across the table. It was the airline's official statement, direct, unapologetic, transparent. A clear stance against discrimination. No names were listed. But the message was loud: respect is not a reward, it's a right. Micah read it and gave a small nod. "That's enough." Kenneth added, "You'll have a car waiting outside. And a formal letter of gratitude will be sent to your parents." As the teen stood, Kenneth looked at them once more. "What happened today won't just disappear. But what you did will matter longer than you know." They nodded politely and walked to the exit. No celebration. No final word. Just a quiet exit, box still in hand, dignity intact. Outside, the city continued like nothing had changed. But inside one airline, something had. A reminder had been delivered in silence that dignity doesn't shout, but when carried with grace, it becomes unshakable. And in one flight, without ever leaving the ground, 2 teenagers proved that sometimes the most powerful stance you can take is refusing to be moved. In this story, we witnessed how a quiet act of self-respect by 2 young individuals disrupted an entire system. Micah and Sierra Johnson didn't shout. They didn't retaliate. They didn't argue. Instead, they held their ground with calm, quiet dignity, and that was enough to shift power, correct a wrong, and expose a deeply rooted bias. This story isn't just about a flight or a mistaken assumption. It's about what happens when we challenge unfairness, not with rage, but with resolve. It's about how grace under pressure can be louder than confrontation, and how the weight of silence, when paired with truth, can carry farther than any raised voice. Micah and Sierra didn't need to prove their worth, they simply reminded the world that their worth should never have been questioned. The lesson here is simple, but powerful: never underestimate the strength of calm conviction. In a world where people often believe volume equals power, this story proves that presence, poise, and self-respect are often stronger. And to those who wear authority as a shield for judgment, this is a reminder: your title doesn't protect you when you forget to treat others with dignity. To every person listening right now, especially those who've been underestimated, overlooked, or disrespected because of how they look, this story is for you. Let it remind you that you don't have to be loud to be heard. You don't have to fight to be seen. Sometimes, all it takes is holding your place, standing in truth, and letting your strength speak for itself. And to those in positions of power, this is your mirror. Look into it. Ask yourself not just how you lead, but how you judge. The smallest assumption, acted on with pride, can become the biggest mistake of your career. From all of us at US Heartwarming Story, thank you for watching and listening. Your time matters, and we're grateful you chose to spend a few moments with us today. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the stories that matter most. Until next time, remember this: respect isn't earned by title, it's revealed in how we treat others. Stay kind. Stay grounded. And when the world tests you, stand firm. Because sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that refuses to be moved.